The battlefield, chaos, screams, steel tearing through flesh. The gladius strikes, blood pours out. Roman glory, they called it. But in that moment, it feels more like hell. And then what? What happens to those who survive? Not the ones who die with honor, but the ones who come back, broken in body and shattered in mind. Rome honored its generals with triumphal arches, its gods with sacrifices after every victory. But the common soldier came back different, scarred, disfigured, carrying wounds no one wanted to see. This video is about them, the forgotten, the ones who made it home, but never truly returned. We're going to dive into the world of wounded soldiers in ancient Rome, because the real face of war doesn't show itself until the fighting is over. Roman warfare was brutal and up close. There was no safe distance, no room to breathe and reach vital organs with brutal precision. A silent, efficient, and repetitive tool of death. But when it didn't kill instantly, it left scars that never fully healed. Spears and pilum tore through flesh and bone, often splitting limbs in two. Darts with heavy curved tips were designed to deform on impact, making them hard to remove and causing internal lacerations that quickly became infected. And when the enemy was barbarian, like Celts or Germanic tribes, the result could be even worse. Their weapons were more primitive, but also more destructive. Axes that tore off entire arms, maces that crushed skulls, long swords that left open, ragged wounds. Roman medical sources, especially De Medicina by Aulus Cornelius Celsus, describe wounds beyond what is tolerable. Exposed entrails, multiple fractures, teeth torn out, disfigured faces. Many who survived the battle died days later, victims of infections, fevers, or silent necrosis. There was no time to sterilize anything. The wounded fell onto filthy ground, mixed with mud, excrement, and the blood of other men and animals. If they were lucky, they were dragged away. If not, they were left behind until the battle ended. The pain didn't stop with the fighting. In most cases, it was only beginning. But even when the body held on, the mind didn't always survive. Because there was another war, an invisible one. There were soldiers who came back with no visible wounds, no cuts, no fractures, no limbs lost. But something inside them had broken. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder already existed in Rome, only without a name, without diagnosis, and worse still, without compassion. These men suffered in silence, constant insomnia, bursts of rage, irrational fears, isolation. Many lived on the margins, unable to reconnect with their families or with civilian life. Some returned to the army, not out of loyalty, but out of desperation. Others simply vanished from society, living as wanderers or dying by suicide. Roman culture, however, didn't understand this as a consequence of war. It called it weakness, a lack of virtues. A good man, they said, endured everything with dignity. To feel too much was suspicious. To suffer in silence was the bare minimum. Tacitus, in his Annals, mentions veterans from the Germanic campaigns who rejected the company of their fellow citizens, avoided celebrations, shunned human contact. They didn't speak of the wars, as if merely remembering them was unbearable. They were alive, but a part of them had died on the battlefield. Rome knew how to forge soldiers. It knew how to crush enemy armies, but it didn't know, or didn't want, to take in those who came back broken inside. Pain that didn't bleed was invisible to the empire, and when the pain did bleed, when flesh was torn open, When blood poured, those who took charge of it were men with another kind of courage. The Medici, legionary doctors, military physicians trained not to save lives in the modern sense, but to keep soldiers alive just long enough for them to keep serving. Roman medicine was brutally pragmatic. Every permanent camp had a valetudinarium, a military hospital divided into specific areas: open wounds, fevers, infections, and convalescence. The Medici operated following the teachings of authors like Celsus, Galen, and Dioscorides, using vinegar and wine as antiseptics, and plants like mandrake or willow bark to ease pain. But when a wound was severe, there were no miracles, only fire and iron. Cauterization with red-hot bars was used to stop bleeding. If a wound began to rot, amputation was the only option. The instruments: bronze saws, iron hooks, crude forceps. The anesthesia: wine, and if lucky, some natural sedative. The screams, according to reports, were heard throughout the entire camp. The mortality rate was high, but the Medici were respected and feared, not because they healed, but because they decided who could be saved, who had to lose an arm, and who would not see the next sunrise. They weren't healers. They were emergency surgeons in an era when every cut was a sentence. Even those who escaped their hands and survived their wounds still faced one of the greatest challenges: leaving the battlefield and reaching a place where they could try to recover. If they were far from a permanent camp, severely wounded soldiers had to be transported under conditions that today would be considered inhumane. Improvised stretchers made with spears and cloaks, carts without suspension pulled by oxen over roads of stone and mud. Every bump was torture. Roman logistics were efficient, but not compassionate. The priority was to keep the legion moving, not to preserve the pain of the wounded. When the battle had just ended and the terrain was unstable, many died along the way, agonizing in silence between the jolts of Roman roads. In imperial times, the advancement of military infrastructure brought improvements. The valetudinaria became standard in large permanent camps. These rudimentary structures had sections for different types of treatment, some drainage for dirty water, wooden beds, and basic stocks of surgical instruments made of copper or iron. But even in those centers, conditions were far from safe. The lack of knowledge about germs and bacteria meant that infection was almost a guaranteed sentence. Soldiers could escape the enemy's sword, but not the invisible microorganisms that accumulated in open wounds, dirty cloths, and reused instruments. In the silence of the valetudinarium, far from the cries of battle, a new war began, against time, infection, and the decomposition of the soldier's own body. The greatest threat to the severely wounded was no longer the blade, but gangrene. Without antibiotics or real understanding of bacteria, a simple puncture could turn into a deadly source of necrosis. Tissue would blacken, and the foul smell would announce death before the fever. The pain was described as unbearable: constant burning, chills, delirium. And while Roman doctors were experienced, they were limited to empirical solutions. Herbal compresses made from elder, rue, and garlic were applied, treatments mentioned by Dioscorides in his De Materia Medica. In some cases, they helped reduce inflammation. In others, they merely delayed the inevitable. Galen, one of the greatest physicians of antiquity, wrote that many times the only possible decision was the complete amputation of the affected limb. But even that, without proper hygiene, could lead the patient to septicemia, a generalized infection. Infection did not distinguish between heroes. Decorated soldiers died just like inexperienced recruits, slowly, with fever, lying on wooden beds on the fringes of an empire that could do little for them. The battle against gangrene was not epic. It had no glory, no audience. It was silent, solitary, and cruel. But for those who managed to survive, the next challenge was another. What did Rome do with the men who could no longer fight? Rome promised much to its soldiers, and it kept its promises for some. Legionaries who survived long enough to complete 20 or 25 years of service received the missio honesta, an honorable discharge that guaranteed substantial compensation, a plot of land, a lifelong pension, even Roman citizenship in the case of foreigners. Many of these veterans were resettled in military colonies and spent the rest of their lives as farmers, merchants, or local leaders. It was the reward for years of blood and loyalty, but most of the severely wounded did not make it that far. Many were discharged before reaching the minimum service time under the status of missio caesaria, a discharge justified by medical reasons. Symbolically honorable, yes, but without the guarantees of the missio honesta. In practice, this meant returning home mutilated, without state support, without land, without salary. These soldiers depended on the compassion of relatives, the generosity of superior officers, or sheer luck. Because Rome, despite exalting the image of the warrior, rarely extended its hand to those who could no longer fight. Monuments celebrated the victories, the generals, the invincible legions, but never the broken bodies that made those conquests possible, then a home to return to. For every proud veteran who received honors, there were dozens forgotten in the alleys of the provinces, mutilated, stigmatized, and often rejected by a society that glorified strength but despised disability. Not all wounded men were immediately discarded. The Roman army, pragmatic by nature, knew that even a damaged body could be useful as long as the mind still worked and the hands could write, give orders, or keep watch. Soldiers who had lost the ability to fight but still retained some functionality could be reassigned. Many became scribai, responsible for the camp's bureaucracy, supply records, payroll accounting, movement reports. Others became instructors, passing on their practical experience to new recruits. Some were assigned as guards in supply depots or watchtowers, where physical demands were lower. This reuse of the wounded body was more common under pragmatic and organized governments like those of Trajan or Hadrian. But during times of political crisis, economic collapse, or prolonged wars, those opportunities became scarce. Everything depended on the context, the local commander, the availability of roles, and even the goodwill of whoever was in power. For many veterans, these administrative roles were a lifeline, a way to maintain some dignity and survive within the system that had shaped them. But it was never guaranteed. And for everyone who found refuge in the military machinery, there were others who fell into disgrace, not because of their wounds, but because of their mistakes. Because if there was anything worse than returning mutilated from war, it was returning dishonored. The missio ignominiosa was the most cruel form of discharge in the Roman army, reserved for those accused of cowardice, serious desertion, indiscipline, or behavior considered unworthy of a soldier. It wasn't just a dismissal, it was a social condemnation. The man expelled in ignominy lost all his rights. No pension, no land, no recognition. His name was erased from the records with contempt. And in a society obsessed with honor, that meant something deeper than poverty. It meant dehumanization. Many of those ex-soldiers lived on the fringes of society, jobless, unprotected, stripped of dignity. There are inscriptions on frontiers like Britannia that reveal the existence of men who, even wounded, were marked with ignominy and carried that shame to the grave. Other accounts speak of veterans ignored even by their own families, as if they carried a moral plague. In Rome, virtues, courage, discipline, loyalty was the foundation of the masculine ideal. To lose that was to be excluded not only from the army, but from the very idea of citizenship. For many wounded veterans, the war ended, but the need to survive did not. Without guaranteed pensions, without land, without family support, these men had to find some way to make a living, even with bodies marked by pain. Some used the little they had received upon leaving the army to open small taverns, repair shops, or work as street vendors. Others sought minor public positions in cities and provinces: market inspectors, urban guards, administrative assistants. These were humble roles, but they offered stability and sometimes respect. But there were also those who chose a darker path. Wounded yet still capable of wielding a weapon, they became mercenaries, selling their military experience to senators, aristocrats, or merchant caravans. Others joined gladiator schools, where violence became profession once again, now as entertainment. Such was the case of figures like Spiculus, a famous gladiator in the time of Nero, whose possible origin was military. The arena offered fame and rewards, but also a quick death. For many, it was the only way to turn their suffering into currency, a brutal exchange, honor for bread. The Rome that displayed warriors in marble statues also sold their pain in spectacles for the masses. And among the options of a hard life, death in the amphitheater sometimes seemed more dignified than oblivion. For veterans who couldn't obtain land, work, or any form of reintegration, the most difficult fate remained: to survive without glory. In cities like Rome, Alexandria, or Carthage, it was common to find former wounded soldiers living on the streets, reduced to begging, with amputated limbs, visible scars, and empty stares. These were men who once marched with the most powerful legions in the world, now begging in the shadow of temples. Some weren't even recognized as veterans. They had been forgotten by the state, by society, by everyone. The glory that once sustained them had evaporated. Emperor Augustus tried to solve this problem by creating the Aerarium Militare, a military fund financed by taxes intended for the payment of pensions. In theory, it was a revolution, an institutional guarantee for those who had served. And for a time it worked. Under organized emperors like Vespasian, the fund was reinforced. But under others like Nero, it was ignored or diverted for palace luxuries. The truth is that in times of crisis, the first to be abandoned were those who could no longer fight. Many veterans died waiting for a pension that never came. Others were saved by small administrative jobs offered by commanders or local governors. But most disappeared, swallowed by the anonymous crowd of an empire that knew how to use their bodies but didn't know how to care for their scars. Rome won battles on 3 continents, toppled kingdoms, built cities, and raised monuments that still stand the test of time. But behind every victory celebrated in marble, there were thousands of broken men, bleeding for an empire that often discarded them once they ceased to be useful. This video is not about generals or glory. It's about the common soldiers, those who lost legs, eyes, brothers, and returned home only to find silence, indifference, or misery. It's about a debt the empire owed each of them and never fully paid, because surviving Roman war was only the beginning of another war, against abandonment, chronic pain, lack of meaning, and, for many, against oblivion. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so that more voices from the past may be heard, and comment below. Do you think Rome owed more to its soldiers? And as always, may Mars guide you in battle.